White woman calls cops on black teen, then freezes when his powerful mother arrives. In some places, even a single step can be enough for someone to call the police. And in Wellington Heights, a high-end residential neighborhood on the southern edge of Charlotte, North Carolina, that happened one seemingly peaceful afternoon. Owen Dawson, 17 years old, had just finished a 3-hour basketball practice at Westside High School. He was the team's starting point guard, stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, broad-shouldered, with brown skin and worn-out Nike sneakers. Sweat soaked through his gray hoodie, and he carried a heavy backpack filled with his practice uniform, a water bottle, and a second pair of Jordans. Owen was supposed to take the number 33 bus home, but that day he decided to take a shortcut through Wellington Heights, the wealthy neighborhood where his best friend Tyler used to live before moving away. With his earbuds tucked in and Kendrick Lamar's music blaring, Owen had no idea he was entering a place where his mere presence, even harmless, felt wrong to others. Inside house number 314, Vivian Elliott, 52 years old, a widow and former elementary school teacher, was enjoying a cup of jasmine tea by the window. Wellington Heights had long been a world of leashed Labradors on evening walks, SUVs parked neatly in garages, and lawns trimmed to the millimeter. She knew everyone in the neighborhood, from Mr. Peterson, who played chess on Sunday mornings, to the young couple at 319, who had just welcomed a baby last month. But the boy walking past? She didn't recognize him. There was no reason why someone like that should be walking alone through this area around 6 p.m. in the fading light of dusk. Everything, from the way Owen pulled up his hoodie to his slow but steady stride, made Vivian frown. At first, she hesitated. Maybe just some kid coming home from school, she mumbled. But then, the headlines she read every morning replayed in her mind. Suburban home broken into. Teens posing as students to steal valuables. Her hand reached for the iPhone beside the lavender vase on the table. 911, I need to report a suspicious individual, Vivian said, her voice slightly trembling. A female dispatcher responded with the usual professionalism. Yes, ma'am. Please provide more details. Vivian took a deep breath and stared through the glass window. A young black male. Tall, wearing a gray hoodie, carrying a backpack. I've never seen him around here before. He looks like he might be scoping out houses. Is he doing anything suspicious, ma'am? Not exactly. It just doesn't feel right, Vivian replied, her eyes never leaving Owen. It was a call that lasted only 94 seconds. But within less than 5 minutes, patrol car number 042, driven by Officer Crispin and his younger partner Phelim, pulled out from the intersection of Kingsbury Avenue, emergency lights flashing, and entered Wellington. In a place where the grass is watered on schedule and mailboxes are dusted weekly, a black teenager simply walking by is enough to trigger the quiet fears of an entire community. And as Owen adjusted his earbuds, switching the song to Kendrick's All Right, he had no idea. He was about to be stopped. Not for his past, not for a crime, but for the color of his skin. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the dramatic and gripping stories we have coming your way. At the Charlotte 911 Dispatch Center, an encoded signal appeared on screen under Priority Level 2 Emergency. Black male youth. Suspicious. Possible trespassing. Unclear presence in Wellington Heights residential area. From a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes, the entire emergency response system operated like a pre-programmed machine. No one asked follow-up questions. No one verified. No one paused to wonder, could it just be a kid walking by? The answer had already been set the moment the name Wellington Heights was paired with the phrase black teenager backpack, and that was enough. Vivian Elliott, after ending the call, remained pressed against the glass window. Her eyes stayed fixed on Owen's figure, even though he was merely stopping at the street corner to change songs. Sometimes, prejudice doesn't shout. It whispers, just enough to guide a person's actions. Less than 2 miles away, Patrol Vehicle 042 rolled steadily down Holly Creek Road. Inside, Officer Crispin, 43 years old, with 15 years of service, once awarded a medal for handling an armed incident, gripped the wheel, glancing at the dispatch monitor. Beside him, Officer Phelim, only 2 years on the force, still carrying a small notepad in his shirt pocket, activated the GPS to guide them into Wellington. "Any additional info?" Phelim asked. "That's all. Male, black, underage, carrying a backpack. Looks like he's scouting houses," Crispin replied, his voice steady, but his hands tightening around the steering wheel. Phelim frowned. "That's enough to dispatch a unit?" Crispin didn't answer. Instead, he switched on the emergency lights, silenced the siren, and made a sharp turn into Wellington, as if entering a high-risk zone. Within seconds, they spotted Owen walking along the sidewalk, head lowered against the afternoon sun, still unaware of the storm heading his way. Tires screeched as the patrol car halted by the curb. Both doors swung open. "Stop! Hands up!" Crispin shouted, his hand hovering near his waist, where his Glock 22 was holstered. Startled, Owen pulled out his earbuds, turned around, eyes wide. He froze, instinctively raising his hands. "Did I do something wrong, sir?" His voice remained calm, but his breathing quickened, and his legs clearly trembled. He still held his heavy backpack. "What's in the bag?" Crispin approached, eyes scanning like an X-ray of suspicion. "Basketball gear, shoes and jersey." "Where do you live?" Phelim asked, hand resting on the edge of his bulletproof vest. "Ellsworth Street, 2 blocks away, number 712. "Then why take this route?" "I took a shortcut. Didn't wait for the bus today." Though Owen's answers were clear, honest, and coherent, Crispin's eyes didn't soften. He snatched the backpack, unzipped it, and rummaged through it. Worn-out sneakers, a sweat-soaked jersey, a towel, a Gatorade bottle. Nothing else. And yet, there was no apology. Not a single, "We were mistaken." Phelim glanced at Crispin, hesitant. Maybe he is telling the truth. Crispin clenched his jaw. "Then why would someone call it in?" Owen was about to respond, but he suddenly noticed a black SUV slowing down in the distance. He recognized the license plate instantly. Instinctively, he whispered, "Mom." The vehicle came to a soft stop in front of the three of them. The door opened. High heels struck the concrete sharply. The woman who stepped out, tall figure, navy blazer, eyes sharp like lasers, was none other than Louisa Dawson, Owen's mother. But what Crispin and Phelim didn't know, Louisa Dawson was not just a mother looking for her son. She was the mayor of Charlotte, and she had arrived at the exact moment to witness her son being treated like a suspect only because of his brown skin and a backpack. The black Cadillac Escalade SUV, bearing the official license plate of the city of Charlotte, glided smoothly into Wellington Heights like an exclamation point dropped into the middle of a tranquil sentence. The soft screech of brakes echoed against the pristine asphalt. In that moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled, birds ceased their song, and all eyes, from Owen, the 2 officers, to Mrs. Vivian Elliott, locked onto the door as it swung open. Each step in high heels echoed firm and resolute. Louisa Dawson didn't need dramatic flair. Her presence alone was a declaration of power. The navy blazer hugged her lean figure at 46, hair neatly pulled into a bun, one hand holding a phone, the other clutching a matte black clutch embossed with the city's seal. This was not merely a mother searching for her son. This was a seasoned politician, the sitting mayor of Charlotte, stepping into the heart of a bias-laden incident. "What exactly is going on here, officer?" Her voice wasn't loud, but each word was scalpel-sharp and precise. Crispin flinched slightly. He had seen this face on campaign billboards for last year's Charlotte for All initiative. He never imagined he'd meet Louisa Dawson on a quiet street in a situation like this. Phelim, still holding Owen's backpack, quickly dropped his gaze. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious person walking through the neighborhood." Crispin tried to keep his voice even, but his throat had gone dry. Louisa tilted her head, her eyes glancing at Owen, her son standing still, brow furrowed, eyes glassy, then turned back to face the officers. "Suspicious? This teenager?" she asked, stepping forward to stand between Owen and the two uniformed men. "Since when did wearing a hoodie, carrying a backpack, and walking near home become criminal behavior?" Without waiting for a reply, Louisa unlocked her phone, swiped quickly, and held it up in front of the officers. "This is Owen Dawson, a 12th grade student at Westside High. This is his student ID. This is his home address, 712 Ellsworth Street, exactly 2 blocks away. And this is a photo of the two of us at last month's Community Day, taken and posted by the city's communications office." Phelim swallowed hard. Crispin, who had spent 5 years in the Rapid Response Unit, now felt sweat gathering in his palms. Owen stood behind his mother, eyes red, not out of fear, but from the realization that if the woman standing in front of him weren't Mayor Louisa Dawson, the outcome today would be completely different. Perhaps a trip to the precinct, perhaps cold metal cuffs, or worse. Vivian Elliott stood frozen on her second-floor balcony, phone still in hand. Her eyes widened in horror. She had called the police out of suspicion toward a black boy, and now she was watching that same boy be defended by one of the most powerful women in the state, a mother, a mayor. And now, the one staring directly into the disoriented eyes of 2 police officers. No shouting was needed, no confrontation. Louisa's presence alone was the most forceful pressure. "Let me ask again," she said, eyes locked deep into Crispin's. "On what basis did you stop my son, search his backpack, and question his whereabouts, other than his skin color and his presence on a clean sidewalk?" No one answered. No one could. "You call this procedure?" Louisa asked, her eyes unblinking, her voice cold and resolute, like a verdict being read aloud. Crispin stood up straight, but his lips pressed tightly together. His gaze avoided hers. Yes, we were dispatched because of a call from a resident," he said, voice slightly hoarse. "We were just following protocol." "Protocol," Louisa repeated the word, as if etching it into the minds of everyone present. "A protocol that begins with baseless suspicion, then leads to questioning, searching, and making a 17-year-old child feel like a threat in the very city his mother governs." Phelim, the younger officer, didn't dare raise his head. He looked down at his hands, which had rummaged through Owen's backpack just minutes ago, searching for something that never existed, evidence of wrongdoing. But Owen had only a water bottle, a worn pair of Converse shoes, a sweat-soaked basketball jersey, and a few books. They were the belongings of a typical student, except for the one thing that made him suspicious in someone's eyes: the color of his skin. Louisa turned to her son. Owen stood still, his face like someone who had weathered a violent storm. He didn't cry, but those eyes, brimming with suppressed hurt, tightened her heart. From a distance, Vivian Elliott still stood frozen behind her second-floor window. Her eyes glistened, uncertain whether from fear or shame. Louisa took one step toward her, but kept her distance. "You made the call, didn't you?" Louisa asked, not raising her voice, yet every word rang clear. Vivian didn't deny it. She stammered, I just thought. The boy looked unfamiliar. I didn't recognize him. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just concerned about the neighborhood. Concerned? Louisa tilted her head slightly. A boy in a hoodie, carrying a backpack, walking in broad daylight, made you feel concerned? Vivian tried to explain. I'm not prejudiced. I'm not that kind of person. I just thought, what if there was a burglary? What would you think, Louisa interrupted, if your son, on an ordinary afternoon, just for stepping onto an unfamiliar street, was forced to raise his hands, interrogated like a criminal, and searched in front of people who knew nothing about him? A faint breeze passed through. On the road, a few neighbors had begun to gather at a distance, watching everything unfold. They didn't intervene, but their expressions, some curious, some confused, some looking down, created a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Vivian lowered her head. For the first time, she found herself with no words to shield her. The reasons that once seemed logical in her mind now sounded like hollow justifications. He could have been handcuffed, Louisa continued. Could have been shoved into a car. Worse, he might not have come home tonight. Why? Because someone who's lived here for 20 years didn't recognize his face. Owen gently tugged at his mother's sleeve. Louisa turned to him. That touch wasn't to stop her from speaking, but to anchor her in the present, to remind her that he was still here, still safe, but no longer the carefree boy he once was. Crispin spoke suddenly, his voice slow. If there's nothing further, we'll withdraw. No, Louisa replied. The issue is already plain. The issue is not my son, but your instinctive response, and the system that created it. Crispin bowed his head. Phelim stayed silent. Vivian retreated into her home like a shadow, and Owen, for the first time, felt like he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. A threshold where behind him lay the laughter of childhood, and ahead of him stood a world that must now be viewed with caution. The black SUV rolled quietly out of Wellington Heights, carrying Louisa and Owen Dawson. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was heavy, as if all sound had been drained from the air. Louisa gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was still reeling from the images that had just unfolded. Owen sat beside her, his blank gaze fixed on the window. He said nothing, but the way his hands clutched at the hem of his shirt betrayed the storm of emotion surging within. He had just gone through an experience no teenager should have to face, being suspected, being searched, all because of the color of his skin. Louisa glanced at her son, heart aching. She knew that even though she had intervened in time, the emotional wound Owen had suffered would not heal easily. She wanted to say something, but any words of comfort now felt hollow. Meanwhile, at house number 14, Vivian Elliott still stood silently by the window. She watched the car disappear from view, a weight settling in her chest. She had called the police simply because she saw a black boy walking through the neighborhood. She asked herself, if that boy hadn't been Louisa Dawson's son, what would have happened? That question echoed in her mind, unanswered. Officer Phelim stood at the curb, his eyes following the SUV. He felt ashamed and confused. He realized he had acted based on bias, not reason. He asked himself, could I have done something differently? Officer Crispin, with 15 years of experience, remained standing there, but the usual confidence in his eyes was gone. He muttered, "Procedure?" But even he felt how hollow those words sounded. The SUV kept rolling forward, carrying the heavy thoughts of mother and son. Louisa knew this wouldn't be the last time Owen would face discrimination, But she also knew he wouldn't face it alone. She would always be there, to protect and support her son. Owen sat still, eyes gazing out the window, hands tightly clasped together. He had just endured a painful experience, being suspected, being searched, simply because of the color of his skin. The feeling of being treated as a suspect in the very city where he was born and raised left him confused and wounded. Louisa glanced at her son, her heart aching. She knew that even though she had arrived in time, the emotional wound Owen had suffered would not heal easily. She wanted to say something, but any words of comfort at that moment felt hollow. "Are you okay?" Louisa asked softly. Owen shook his head slightly. "I don't know. What would have happened if you hadn't shown up in time?" Louisa gripped the steering wheel tightly, her chest tightening. "We've talked about this, but I wish we never had to." Silence. Inside it was the weight of a collective pain, the pain carried by thousands of parents who have taught their children how to survive in a world built on prejudice. Owen sighed, still looking out the window. He remembered the things his mother had told him. Always stay calm, never resist, and always carry identification. But he never imagined those words would come to life this soon. Louisa looked at her son, filled with worry. She knew this wouldn't be the last time Owen would face discrimination. But she also knew he would never have to face it alone. She would always be there, to protect and support her son. Night fell over the West Charlotte District Police Station, but the atmosphere in the break room remained stifling. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow, revealing the contemplative expression on the face of young Officer Phillum. He sat in front of a computer screen, no longer as spirited as he usually was. His fingers tapped slowly on the keyboard. Racial profiling. Each word appeared like a blow to the understanding he thought he once had. He kept searching. Implicit bias, police escalation, youth racial trauma. Each term brought up a flood of articles, statistics, reports from policy and social research institutes. A 2023 report from the National Institute of Justice appeared. Over 68% of youth of color had been stopped by police without specific evidence of wrongdoing. Of those, nearly 30% said they were not even told why they were being searched. Phillum recalled Owen's eyes, not the eyes of someone angry, but of someone far too used to being suspected. That teenage boy was only 17, on his way home, sweat not yet dry after practice, and yet he was treated like an intruder. Footsteps echoed behind him. Crispin, his seasoned partner, walked into the room holding a cup of cold coffee. Their eyes met for a second. Phillum started to speak, but Crispin simply nodded, walked past him, and sat down in the chair opposite, without saying a word. No one mentioned the Owen Dawson incident, but both knew it lingered like a heavy cloud in the sealed-off room. On the break room's large screen, an internal news bulletin flashed. Mayor of Charlotte's son unjustly questioned. Incident sparks community backlash. Below was an image of Louisa Dawson, looking fierce and determined, her eyes sharp. The subheading: City government calls for internal investigation into police intervention procedures. Phillum read every line carefully. He didn't see his name, nor Crispin's, but he knew. They were the parts left out of the story. The ones who erred, yet went unnamed, unaccounted for, and unrequired to apologize. He remembered the moment Owen looked back at him one last time before stepping into the SUV. No anger, no hatred, just the look of someone who had lost faith. In people, in the system, in fairness. And that look haunted more than any reprimand ever could. The clock on the wall read 10:48 p.m. A long night ahead, but for Phillum, the keystrokes before him were forming questions not easily answered. When will police stop reacting with suspicion? When will procedure stop being a mask for prejudice? And when will the words left out of the reports finally be heard? Outside the glass windows, the city of Charlotte remained still. But inside the watchroom, a quiet reckoning had just begun. The next morning, before the sun had risen high, Louisa Dawson sat in front of her laptop in the kitchen, bathed in warm yellow light. The coffee hadn't even been brewed yet, but her thoughts were already boiling. Not from anger, but from a greater sense of responsibility, to use her voice to illuminate what should have been obvious to everyone. On her personal page, followed by nearly 180,000 people, mostly Charlotte residents and social justice advocates, Louisa typed each sentence with sharp composure. Last night, my son was stopped for walking through a neighborhood where he knows people, carrying a sports backpack after practice. He was interrogated like a suspect, despite no wrongdoing. But this is not just about Owen. This is the story of countless other young black men. Every step my son takes is one I've had to clear in advance, with education, with warnings, with constant reminders. But in 2025, why must a 17-year-old still explain his right to exist? Existence should not be a reason for suspicion. Accompanying the post was a photo of Owen in his basketball uniform, smiling brightly at a community event, the same photo she had shown the police the night before. Below the image, the caption read simply, "This is who they called suspicious." In less than an hour, the post had been shared over 12,000 times. By noon, it surpassed 40,000. Local news outlets like the Charlotte Sentinel and QC News, and then national networks like CNN and NBC, began reporting on the incident. The hashtag number, #WalkingWhileBlack, returned to Twitter's trending topics, this time tied to the name Owen Dawson. Organizations like Color of Change, the NAACP Charlotte chapter, and Youth for Equity issued coordinated statements. They called the incident a living example of the ongoing racial bias in law enforcement. At Westside High School, several teachers led discussions during sociology class using Louisa's post as the central prompt. The right to move when skin color becomes a checkpoint. Meanwhile, across town, Vivian Elliott sat alone on her sofa, her phone still open to Louisa's Facebook page. The bold sentence, 17 years old, and still has to justify his existence, echoed in her mind like an unending bell. Vivian didn't hit like she didn't comment. She just stared. Her eyes were red. Inside her was an emptiness no status update could ease. She remembered the phone call, the hesitation before dialing, the invisible force that made her press 911. She hadn't thought it would become a big deal. She hadn't expected police, an SUV, or a mother stepping out like a gust of wind that swept away every false assumption. And what frightened her the most was the part of herself that had instinctively assumed that boy didn't belong there. No evidence, no reason, just a feeling. And that feeling had nearly led to something irreversible. Vivian turned off her phone, but the noise inside couldn't be silenced. She didn't know if she had the courage to apologize to Louisa or Owen. But she knew one thing for sure. She could no longer pretend this didn't matter. She no longer had the right to believe it was just a misunderstanding, because this time she had seen something she couldn't unsee, the truth. And that truth was the first step toward change. 1 week after the incident, on a gloomy Thursday afternoon, the large auditorium of Westside High School was packed. Nearly 300 people were present, students, teachers, parents, and community representatives. The event was titled, "Unconscious Bias in White Communities, When Silence Becomes Complicity." In the audience, no one noticed the woman in a gray sweater sitting tucked into the back row. It was Vivian Elliott. She had arrived early, chosen the farthest seat, arms clutching her purse, eyes scanning the room as if silently wondering, "Does anyone know who I am?" Louisa Dawson stepped onto the stage. Unlike her previously firm appearance, today she wore a simple earth-toned dress, her hair neatly tied back. But her eyes still carried that unwavering resolve, the look of a mother well-versed in protecting her child with both heart and intellect. "Thank you all for coming," Louisa began, her voice calm. "I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as a mother. And I'm not here to speak only about Owen, but about every child who lives with the fear of being suspected simply because of their skin." The auditorium fell silent. Louisa paused briefly, then turned to the right side of the stage, where Owen Dawson, 17 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, dressed in a white shirt, walked slowly to the podium. He took a deep breath, eyes fixed straight ahead. "I'm not someone who likes to talk a lot," Owen began, his voice clear and steady. "But that day, I was scared. Not because of the sirens, or because 2 men twice my size looked at me with suspicion, but because of that question. Why are you here?" A murmur spread gently through the rows of seats. "That's the neighborhood where my friend lives. I was just passing through. But they didn't ask my name, didn't ask if I needed help. They asked like I didn't have the right to be there." Owen lowered his head briefly, then lifted it again, his gaze filled with quiet control. "That was the moment I realized. Sometimes people don't need to forbid you. They just need to make you feel like you don't belong." In the shadows, Vivian clutched the strap of her purse tightly. Every word from Owen pierced through the protective shell of justification she had spent the past week constructing. She had told her neighbors, "I meant no harm, I was just being cautious." But now, she began to see how dangerously thin the line was between caution and discrimination. An 11th grade student named Grace Morgan stood up to speak. "I'm white, and that same night, I also walked through that neighborhood after tutoring, wearing a hoodie, with headphones on. No one called the police. No one looked at me like I didn't belong." For the first time, sobs echoed from the audience. The forum lasted nearly 2 hours. Personal stories wove together, from Latino students being stopped for speaking Spanish on school grounds, to an Asian boy being called virus throughout the pandemic. But most resonant was Owen's story, a black child suspected not for his actions, but for his existence. At the end, Louisa and Owen stepped off the stage. On their way back to their seats, they passed by Vivian. She stood up, as if to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Owen paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. There was no hatred, no accusation, just a quiet look, as if to say, "I know." Vivian bowed her head. For the first time in her life, she didn't need to be named to know she was being spoken of. 2 weeks after the forum at Westside High School, an internal email was sent to all public schools in Mecklenburg County. The subject line was brief. Case study: the Owen Dawson incident, bias analysis and community response. It wasn't a sensational headline. It wasn't a condemnation. It was a learning resource, a comprehensive packet including the 911 call transcript, notes from the forum, and Owen's speech. Now part of the curriculum in 64 high schools across the state of North Carolina. In a sociology class in Durham, the teacher guided students through this question: where does bias begin in this situation? At a school in Asheville, an ethics class discussed, if you were Officer Phelan, how would you respond after the incident? New conversations had begun. Meanwhile, at the Charlotte Police Department, a brand new training program had just launched, titled One Step, One Life, Training in Fair Response and Avoiding Racial Bias. Phelim was the first to volunteer to stand before the class. Though only 2 years into the force, he stepped forward with a voice slightly trembling, but eyes full of resolve. He recounted the Owen incident, without glossing over, without excuse. "I don't think I'm a racist," he said, "but I let unconscious bias drive my reflexes. And that day, I realized my silence caused harm too." During the session, a video clip was played. CCTV footage from Vivian's home, showing Owen standing still, removing his headphones, and opening his backpack without resistance. And then Owen's voice echoed in the training room. That question, "Why are you here?" followed me into my sleep. Vivian Elliott sat at her wooden kitchen table in the quiet of her home. She wrote a handwritten letter, not typed in email, not sent anonymously. Each word trembling but clear. "Dear Mrs. Dawson, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say, I was wrong. I let fear and prejudice override reason. I didn't see a boy. I only saw what I thought was a threat. I know now that staying silent is no longer a moral option." Vivian Elliott. Louisa received the letter on a Monday morning. She didn't reply. She didn't write back. She didn't speak about it publicly. But at dinner, she handed the open envelope to Owen. "Read it and decide for yourself," was all she said. Owen read it slowly, his eyes lingering on the phrase, "Staying silent is no longer a moral option." He folded the letter and slipped it into the pocket of his hoodie, the very hoodie that had once made him a suspect. Then he smiled, not because he had forgiven, not necessarily because he had forgotten, but because he knew he was moving forward, not just for himself, but for those who would come after him. And now, the question is for you, the audience of Black Strength Stories. If you were Vivian, would you call the police? Or would you walk outside and ask, "Do you need any help?" If you were Officer Crispin, would you search that backpack? Or would you start with a greeting? If you were Louisa, would you confront, stand tall, or remain silent and endure? And if you were Owen, would you choose anger? Or would you choose to keep walking forward? This story doesn't end here. It begins with each of us, in every daily choice. Share this video if you believe that a small call can change a life, and a small action can save one. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story on Black Strength Stories. The next one might be yours.